You know what? I'm gonna get a little pad.
Hi, everyone. Hello. Can people hear? Sounds like the microphone is not on, or? Great, people can hear. So, hi, everyone. I'm Edward Cohn from the Department of History and the Rosenfield Program in Public Affairs, International Relations, and Human Rights, and I'm delighted to welcome you here today for today's Convocation talk. Before I begin, I want to make sure I thank our partners for this talk. The Office of Development and Alumni Relations, the Scholars Convocation Committee, Conference Operations, and I think most of all, the Helen J. Moyer Fund for the Study of Public Affairs. Just so you know, this fund is intended to honor the memory of Helen Moyer, the wife of Professor Wayne Moyer, to honor her contributions to the Rosenfield program between 1985 and 2008. A frequent attendee at Rosenfield program events, Helen Moyer was a gracious host to visiting speakers, to student committee members, and to other members of the Grinnell community. She helped not just to welcome everyone to her home and to Grinnell College, but to build rapport between all her visitors and to create an atmosphere of camaraderie and community between Grinnell students and visiting experts alike. The Moyer Fund is intended to bring prominent alumni back to campus to meet with students, to share their expertise, and to build connections that will benefit current Grinnellians. Today's visitor is one of our most prominent alumni, Sam Tanenhaus. I don't want to speak for him, but from his most recent book, it sounds like Grinnell College made a big impression. He notes that Grinnell College was the place where he first learned to read and write seriously, and he goes on to thank explicitly a group of 4 alumni who were really helpful to him in writing the book. In the years since his graduation, Mr. Tanenhaus has become a leading American journalist, biographer, and cultural critic. He is the author of 5 books, including a biography of Louis Armstrong and an architectural portrait of Old Greenwich Village. His 4th book, Whittaker Chambers, a biography, won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and was a finalist for both the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award, winning him a reputation that continues to this day as a leading expert on the American right and a leading American biographer. That book, I'll add, received amazing reviews, a coolly objective look at the most controversial figure in the post-war crusade against American communists, one reviewer wrote. The New York Times declared it remarkable, the kind of writing that can keep you propped up against your pillow late at night. Mr. Tanenhaus has worked as an assistant editor at the New York Times from 1997 to 1998, and as a contributing editor at Vanity Fair for the 5 years after that, before he got one of the most prominent jobs in journalism as the editor of the New York Times Book Review. And he continued to write brilliant essays for the New York Times and other publications that showcased his interest in conservatism, his interest in pop culture, and his skill in biography. His most recent articles include an essay on Zoran Mamdani, which concludes, "To make sense of his rise, we do well to set aside data-tested political science and look instead to the lessons of art," as well as a Vanity Fair piece describing Trump's second term as the godfather of presidency. But I suspect that our guest will be best remembered for his latest book, a magisterial 860-page biography of the public intellectual William F. Buckley. This book, which took more than 25 years to write, is a marvel of modern biography. The critic John Gans described it as the definitive intellectual history of the conservative movement. It's a beautiful read, a marvel of structure and craft, and an impressive feat of objective journalism, an account of William F. Buckley's life, building on unprecedented access and on years of friendship that could make dramatic and controversial findings about his attitude toward race while still winning the respect of readers on both the left and the right. Don't take my word for it, though. One, especially if you're a student, we have this book giveaway. So if you didn't sign up, this is your last chance. And whether or not you're a student, you can go to the college bookstore or to your bookseller of choice and order a copy of his book, which I think you'll agree is a marvel. In any case, please join me in welcoming Sam Tanenhaus back to Grinnell.
Thanks very much. I want to notify ICE now we can release the hostages for Ed Cohn's family. You came through, so everybody's good. And also, I told him when I came past the table there with the book that now I know the literal meaning of you can't give it away. Because there they are. It's really fantastic to be back here. This is some of the best and happiest years of my life were spent on this campus. All the distinguished faculty and eminences who were responsible for all of this today that whom Ed mentioned were the new hires when I came here in 1973. And because I'm a timeline guy, I do narratives and biography. I met a brilliant student last night at a dinner we had, and my great friend Morris Strasberg, who actually went to high school with me, who was there, will testify to this, who was telling us about the complex refinements of the Lutheran Church, I think in Nebraska, is class of 2027, which means he's 50 years younger than me, which means it would be like me coming here in my day to listen to someone who was class of 1927. And it's a long, long time. So I'm so grateful for the students I've gotten to meet who've been super interested and kind, or at least faked it very well in that way of Grinnell students. And it reminds me of something I want to start with, and then we'll get into the life and times of Buckley. Let me ask, and it's not a test, it's just so we can get a better sense of how to talk about this, because I do want to have questions and really open things up. How many people, just raise your hand if you know anything about Bill Buckley, if you remember him, you know his name. Okay, a lot of people. Below a certain age, many people have no idea who he was, why he mattered, which is still a matter of, right, question for dispute and debate, but he was very important in his time. I want to start with something else, though, which is a little bit of a cold. As long as my book is, and Ed unfortunately was very exact in describing it, the text is 850 pages. I tell people it's the 850-page gorilla I finally got off my back. Plus, it's got countless endnotes. My professors should be proud. Someone who never wrote a single research paper at Grinnell. And it's got an index, so altogether it's over 1,000 pages. And people will say to me, how could you write so long a book? And the answer is always, you should have seen the first draft. Which meant for me, I had to cut and just delete lots of material I wished I could have kept in. And some of it has to do with Bill Buckley's own campus career. And that's what I wanted to talk about, because especially if there's students here, in my view, and not mine alone, he might have been the most accomplished, in a kind of public way, student journalist of the 20th century, and the most influential person to come out of a college, that is, to be shaped by his college experience, which is what happens to us here. Now, his university was Yale, which is a very different place, and I want to get to that. So one of the passages I really regret having to cut came out of an interview I did with Bill Buckley, and I don't want to pretend any false intimacy when I call him Bill Buckley. Anyone who came into his orbit, including the people who worked in the mailroom at his magazine, National Review, called him Bill. All right, that's just how you referred to him. And when I'm in touch with people who knew him, as I was the entire time I was working on the book, he was born in 1925 and died in 2008, the age of 82, they always referred to him as Bill. Officially out in the world, it was always WFB, William F. Buckley Jr. WFB was the shorthand, but it was Bill to people who knew him. So I got to know him quite well. And I was writing about his amazing career at Yale, which I'm going to talk about. And I had to ask him this question that has come up more than once, which is that although he was a very successful and accomplished student, Dean's List back in the days before there was grade inflation, he didn't always go to class, and he didn't always read the assignments, and he never read a book that wasn't assigned to him. Now, remember, we're talking about the most influential conservative intellectual of the 20th century. So I said, Bill, is it true that you were so busy with your extracurricular activities, running the campus newspaper, running the political union, getting involved in political campaigns and national political campaigns, that you didn't go to the library? Remember, these were the days when if you were going to read a book, you went, like in my day, we went to Burling Library. Nobody has to do that anymore. They have everything in front of their computer. In his case, it was Sterling Library. And he said, and I had a little passage about that. You'd see Buckley everywhere, but not in the paddocks of Sterling Library. Do this kind of literary thing. 16 floors, all the stacks. And he said, Bill, is it true that you weren't really there? It's the one place nobody would ever see you. And he said to me, I can't do accents. I wish I could, because Buckley had a really memorable way of speaking. But I can tell you what the words were. He said, well, I suppose I could have spent my time reading Ulysses. And I really like that, because that's the story of Buckley at Yale. He didn't read James Joyce's Ulysses, but he knew that's the book he should have read. He knew that's the one that had prestige. Okay, so now I'm thinking, and I had to cut it, and now I wish I'd put it back in. And the reason I didn't do it, by the way, is I made a joke about it, and in the book, in the manuscript, it felt a little cheap shottish, and I don't like to do that. Like, I'll give you the warts, I'll give you the good, I'll give you the bad, I'll tell all the unvarnished truths that subjects will wince through, but cheap shots don't seem right. So I didn't do that. But meanwhile, after the book came out in June, I've been to a number of college campuses, university campuses, because Buckley's someone like, Ed here can talk about him very fluently and volubly, and other people can too. He's a part of our history, part of our culture. Here's the big biography that finally came out. So I'm good to bring on a campus, meet with students, talk to faculty. And while I've been doing that, though, I'm a journalist, so I'm also doing some surveillance. Because all you hear about, like everyone else in the world, in the sort of journalistic, literary world, I read the Atlantic Monthly and the New Yorker magazine, and if you open them, any given issue, and any given week, you're going to find out how nobody reads books on campuses. Professors can't teach them. Students don't read them. They can't read a 14-line sonnet. I was an English major, not a history major at Grinnell. All these things. So we go to campus, and often my wife will come with me. We'll go to campus. We're at Cornell University, and we were at Ole Miss at Oxford. I was at Notre Dame a couple months ago. And very bright kids with great teachers, and hearing what goes on in the classroom, the dangers of AI and everything else. And what we're hearing is that nobody's really reading books. Professors don't assign books. And my wife, Kathy, who couldn't come out with me this time, our daughter went to Grinnell, so she has an attachment to it as well. And she said, that's not going to be the case at Grinnell. Said, I guarantee you, you're going to go to Grinnell and you'll find out, and you're going to learn that people are reading books. So, and then another guy who graduated a few years after me sent me a note. He said, well, do some surveillance there and see if books are being read. So I've met with students, and I'm finally meeting with the English students. And I say, so, anybody reading a book? And they said, well, yeah, we're taking Professor Simpson's course on James Joyce's Ulysses. And I said, oh, really? I said, that's interesting, because my wife and I, who adopt something, my therapist says this is a good idea, but that's not why we do it. We read aloud at night. And it's quite amazing what you can read, and the novel we're reading now is Ulysses, so we're right on it. So I said to the students, well, that's interesting, because I'm on a Ulysses kick now, too. And I said, so what do you make? Oh, and at first I said, so you're reading only Ulysses? And they said, no, we're reading these two other novels and literary essays as well, criticism. So, okay. And I said, so what do you all make of what many people consider the single most beautiful sentence in that most beautiful novel, which by extension you could say, some would say, maybe even Eric here would say, you could make the case is the greatest novel ever written in the English language. And they said, oh yeah, we know what sentence you mean. And I said, and I'm going to say it now, and anybody who knows the novel well be familiar with it. It comes at a crucial moment in the book when the Odysseus character, Leopold Bloom, meets his kind of spiritual son, Telemachus, who's Stephen Dedalus, and they're out there at spring night, and they look up, and they see, and here's the famous sentence, the heaven tree of stars hung with humid night blue fruit. And they said, yeah, we know that sentence. And I said, I read recently, I'm sure Eric knows this, that James Joyce said it took him 8 hours to write that sentence. And one of the students said, oh, really? I'm surprised it didn't take him longer. And I thought, that's why we come here. Why do we come here? We're living in a moment where everybody's on their phone every 2 seconds. I was on a college campus where a professor gives his students a 5-minute social media break in the middle of a 50-minute class so they can go outside and look at their phones because they need to do it. We've got TikTok, we've got Instagram, we have everything that comes and goes in 30 seconds. We have news cycles that last a minute, and nobody can remember things that happened 2 weeks ago. And there was a student who's 50 years younger than me who gets that you would actually spend 8 hours writing a single sentence, and also that only the greatest literary genius of the 20th century could have pulled it off. And that maybe if you're not a literary genius, maybe if you're just sort of a person who tries to make a living at it, like me, in your own way, you might try to work that hard as well. And that's why I'm glad my daughter went here. It's why I'm grateful I'm here. I'm so glad to see some of my professors and colleagues here. My mentor is a man named James Kassane. He's over 90. We still email. And he points out the errors in what I write, and that's okay. He's taught me how to do it. And for anybody, I know there are prospective students here and parents, and I hope some of them wander in and out just to feel like it's a community, it's a cosmos when you're at Grinnell. And that's why Grinnell students can get Ulysses. See, if you go to Harvard or Yale, they will tell you, oh yes, Ulysses is a novel an educated person is supposed to know, right? If you come here, they'll say, I can't believe he wrote that sentence in only 8 hours. So now I want to get to the other side of what campus life is like, and that's Bill Buckley, because there is another way to do it. And Buckley was doing other things besides reading Ulysses. He was learning just enough about Ulysses to know that's the book that should be on his list. His background, I'll give it to you briefly. I said he was born in 1925 in what's called the northwest corner of Connecticut. Is anybody familiar with it? Maura, you probably know. You know something about Connecticut. It's the part of Connecticut that's really close to the Berkshires in western Massachusetts, and it's across the border from Dutchess County, New York. And Buckley and his 9 siblings, a wealthy Irish Catholic family, often compared to the Kennedys. Sometimes they were called the conservative Kennedys, and when the Buckley family reached their peak in the 70s, sometimes the Kennedys would be called the liberal Buckleys. There were these 2 families that kind of lived aware of one another, parallel lives. So I tell people, when Bill Buckley and his siblings in the 1930s, when they were children, were raised to hate the villain, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who brought Bolshevism to America, they were talking about the guy they saw each summer at the horse show in Rhinebeck, because FDR and Eleanor were there in the audience when the Buckley siblings were competing in horse shows with Jacqueline Bouvier, the playwright Edward Albee. Right? That's the background that Buckley came out of. But his parents were from the South. His father was from South Texas, 100 miles from the Mexican border. Anybody remember the way Bill Buckley spoke? All the polysyllables and the elongated sentences? Those were the result of English being his third language. His first language was Spanish, which he learned from his nursemaids, because his father was off trying to make money in the oil business and thwart revolutions like one in Mexico, and his mother, anybody who's Catholic of a certain generation will know, she spent 20 years in a continuous cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, nursing. She gave birth to her last child at the age of 43 in 1938, and her last birth almost killed her. So that's the rarefied Catholic Irish background of the Buckleys, and there's a difference between them and the Kennedys. And the Buckleys were snobbish toward the Kennedys. And Bill Buckley, in one of his many books, he wrote 50 of them, said, I don't know why people keep comparing us to the Kennedys, because Joe Kennedy, the patriarch, is very close to Ireland. And Bill Buckley said, the first time my father went to Ireland was to attend the Dublin Horse Show in 1939, because the Buckley style of Catholicism was one his father had picked up in Mexico, which meant the aristocratic elite, and that his mother had been brought up in New Orleans. Two regions of America, South Texas and New Orleans, where the Catholics were elite. So their idea of class and religion and ethnicity, the Buckleys, was totally outside normal American experience for that era. So Buckley was raised on a 47-acre estate, which is still standing. Anybody who follows and knows something about the modern right, the conservative movement, knows that the Young Americans for Freedom, often mistakenly said to have formed on Buckley's own home, which was in Stamford, Connecticut. No, it was his parents' home where they all met, because it really was an estate. You can see it now. It's been broken up into condos, of course, but it's in one of the most beautiful towns in Connecticut, Sharon, Connecticut, not to be confused with Sharon, Iowa, with a beautiful green, elongated green, and a place for wealthy New Yorkers to spend their weekends. But the Buckleys lived there year-round, except in the winters. And this is some of the news in my book, which is that during the winter time, the parents went back to the South. They went to South Carolina. It disappoints but doesn't surprise me that I haven't gotten a lot of invitations, apart from a week I spent in Charleston, to speak to audiences in South Carolina, because that's where the Buckleys had a beautiful antebellum mansion, Camden, South Carolina, that had, now we'll test the Civil War buffs. I know one person in particular who is going to know this. Sarah's going to know it. Where Mary Chestnut, the great Civil War diarist, lived. It was one of her mansions. And the Buckleys bought it in the 1930s and made it this magnificent showplace. And every winter, the Buckleys would go there. So all the questions you've heard about Buckley and race, I've talked about this with students, come from that Southern experience. This is in the days of Jim Crow. And if you read my book, it's too complicated to get into here. But in my own view, I think there's some of the better storytelling that I have in it, is about how the Buckley family experienced race in South Carolina in those years, living up to the Great Brown decision in 1954. And it includes an interview I did with someone a Black American who's still alive. He was in his 80s when I interviewed him 10 years ago. We're friends now. Who worked for the Buckley family and said they were the finest white people he'd ever met in South Carolina. And then when you see the complexities there, and I thought my job, as Ed suggested, is just to tell you what happened and try to make you see how things looked from people's various points of view. And you can decide what that says about Bill Buckley in the context of his stated positions on race and those that the conservative movement built a lot of their support from. So I'll set that aside and then say that when Bill Buckley finished prep school, he went to a school in Dutchess County where he gave his first speech. I found the first speech he ever gave, which was a quite eloquent, even brilliant defense at the age of 15 of his hero, Charles Lindbergh. So think about that. Yeah, as I'm getting the response I want here. This all didn't happen just in the last 10 years. His first hero was Charles Lindbergh, and I interviewed Buckley's closest friend at Millbrook, who's an Englishman who died a number of years ago, a very distinguished journalist and historian, Sir Alistair Horn. Does anybody know that name? He wrote classic books about French culture and history. And he was sent over to Millbrook from England during the Battle of Britain. Wealthy families would send their kids to the United States. And the headmaster of Millbrook, this little school, now it's at 500 acres and thousands, many hundreds of students. Then it was tiny. It had just been founded. The headmaster had the good sense to make the two of them roommates because they were on opposite sides. They would debate on whether the United States should enter in World War II. And Alistair said to me, I interviewed him in his home in England. He said, well, Bill won every time. And I said, well, that's not true. When the vote was taken, it was done in a little debating society, you won all the debates. And yes, he said, I won the debates because people agreed with me. Go back and look at the arguments. You'll see Buckley won every time. That is the worldview that the right maintains to this day. If you, and I don't mean the president necessarily and the people closest to him, I don't really look at much as people like that. If you think of my subjects, Whittaker Chambers was a journalist and literary man. Buckley was a journalist and literary man. It's that outer ring of intellectuals who interests me. Because, here I am, this sort of nebbishy English major, and imagine what it's like to be somebody with the same interests I do, but actually changes the world, right? So people like that fascinate me, and I try to imagine what their lives are like. Well, Buckley, from a very early age, knew he could win the debate on points, but he's going to lose it as far as the audience goes. And he took it. He didn't complain. He just accepted it and moved on because he had the idea that eventually he's going to bring you around. If he can get you to listen to him, maybe you'll change your mind. Who remembers Buckley's firing line program, right? I mean, it was fun to watch just to watch it. And do you remember who some of the guests were? The Black Panthers. I don't mean the Marvel Comics guys, the actual not Bobby Seale, Eldridge Cleaver, who used to stop by Buckley's house for a drink. I don't know if I'd want him coming to my house for a drink, but Buckley didn't have a problem with it. Huey Newton. Huey Newton said to Buckley, so where would you have stood in the American Revolution? Which is actually a great question to ask him if you're a Tory. Muhammad Ali, it's worth the price of admission, which is $0, because you can get it right on YouTube, to see Bill Buckley and Muhammad Ali debating who's right, Malcolm X or Elijah Muhammad, when they split over Islam. And that's the debate they have. So Buckley knew if he could get you listening to him, and if you watched how he comported himself there, maybe one by one he's going to start picking people off, and you're going to go from your side to his side, which is kind of the history of modern American politics, for better and worse. Okay, so Buckley now gets to Yale. He's been in the Army for 2 years, right? Because the war does start. And Buckley's sons, right? Buckley and his 2 older brothers. There were 6 girls and 4 boys in the family. And the 2 older brothers and Bill were of draft age. So they go off and they wear a uniform. Bill Buckley never got overseas. His 2 brothers did. And after the war ends, then he goes to Yale. He's been accepted. This in 1946. And as I say in the book, Bill Buckley finally found a government program he didn't object to. The GI Bill. Because it paid his tuition, that meant he could buy a car, which he did. So he bought a car and he drove it home and brought his friends with him every weekend. And I interviewed another of his friends, famous publisher in New York named Thomas Ginsburg, who's one of the founders of the Paris Review and became the publisher of the Viking Press. And I interviewed him. And these are interviews, by the way, some of them took place as long ago as, 25 years, right? I've told people this book I worked on so long that I interviewed Bill Buckley's childhood piano teacher before she died at the age of 92 in 2003. That's how long I worked on this book. And Tom Ginsburg said, you would not believe what it was like to go to the Buckley house in Sharon, Connecticut, where the family lived. Because at this time, because the Buckleys were the kindest and most generous family in Camden, South Carolina, unlike the other winter colonists from the north, that's what they called them, the winter colony, they would go back north after having spent the winter there, hiring people, most of them black, and letting them go. The Buckleys would either take servants who wanted to, go north with them to Connecticut, find other jobs for them in Camden, or put them on the payroll and find other things for them to do. So you have to take yourself back to the South in 1940 and imagine what that was like. And then you begin to get a better idea, at least I thought I had a better one, of how race worked into all these equations. Well, Buckley goes off to Yale in 1946. He's part of, by far, the largest class in the history of Yale University. It was triple the size of any pre-war class. It had been a wartime campus, so freshmen, it's all men then, right? There were no women at Yale before 1969. It was true for all the Ivy League schools. Grinnell, very different story, as we know. And so the freshmen, some of them were staying in Quonset huts, or they're putting them up in the gymnasium. They don't have enough room for them, and this is important, they don't really have enough money to fund the university. Check mark in Bill Buckley's mind for later use. That Yale, the great institution, is actually hurting financially. No Robert Noyces for Yale University. No Warren Buffetts back in the day. So Buckley's looking around. Buckley's an extremely devout Catholic. The one reason he had, it sounds crazy if you saw him in person, I mean, if you didn't see him in person but only saw him on the screen, is he was actually quite self-effacing in your company. The first time he met me when I was nobody from nowhere, wanted to write a book about Whittaker Chambers when I was 34 years old, he treated me as if I were an honored guest in his home. That's how you build a movement, is by treating people that way, right? And he was interested. Well, who's this guy? Doesn't subscribe to National Review. He's interested in anti-communists and all this Cold War stuff. And I got to know him better and better. He had that power of charm and ingratiation. I know there are a lot of students here, I'm hoping at least, who have read and adults, grown-ups, who've read The Great Gatsby, published the year Bill Buckley was born. And I almost used an epigraph from it. If you remember the line early in The Great Gatsby where it's not exactly, I'm doing this from memory here, but Nick Carraway writes something like, if personality is a series of unbroken gestures, there was something gorgeous about him. A romantic readiness for the hopefulness of life. And I always felt that with Buckley too. He's basically an Irish romantic, right? You can't use those terms anymore. I hope I didn't offend anybody. And so Buckley's at Yale, and he instantly is a sensation on campus. The way he looks, the way he talks, the way he treats people. I talked to classmates of his who came from not privileged backgrounds, right? The GI Bill. They're not letting a lot of black people in, right? But they're letting poorer, right, sort of, in those days would have been like the white lumpen proletariat in. And Buckley's kind to them all. He doesn't care if you have money. He doesn't care what your background is. He wants to know what your politics are. He wants to know if you're religious. He wants to know who you voted for. He wants to know what you're reading. Why does he want to know what you're reading? So he doesn't have to read it. You can tell him what's in it, right? So he developed what I call in the book is one of the, I don't make any great claims for myself as a writer, but one phrase I have that I'm pleased with is, because people who are in the same line of work as him tell me it's right. See, he had what I call predatory attentiveness. He's going to hang on every word you say so he can turn it around and shoot it right back at you. And that's how you become a great debater. That, in addition to not limiting yourself to the kind of shabby confines of the facts. And if you're willing to say anything at any moment, you become a really good debater. It turned against him a couple of times. That's another story. We can do that in questions if people want to know about it. Well, so Buckley's at Yale. He's an instant sensation. He's, you know what it reminds me of a little bit is, have you ever read about Barack Obama at Harvard? How he wasn't really the protege of all those famous professors like Larry Tribe because they actually congregated toward him. That's what happened to Buckley. Everybody knew the way he looked, the way he sounded. He would take his professors to Sharon, Connecticut. Here's the rich oil man's son, right, living in this kind of splendor, in this hacienda. And the house was actually styled like a Mexican hacienda with glass-paneled rooms. You can see a picture of it in the book. And Buckley had this magnetic quality about him, but he worked all the time. So what's he doing? He's not reading Ulysses. What's he doing? He's grilling his professors instead. He learned speed writing when he was about to be drafted because he thought that would get him a desk job in the Army if he could speed write. And so he took a class, he got really good at it, and he would sit in the classroom, and it's like a Professor Simpson or Professor Cohn here is kind of speaking freely, feeling comfortable with the students, and making jokes about topics maybe you're not supposed to. Buckley's writing it all down. He's got the text, he's got the transcript, nobody else does, because that's how I said he was a good student, he was doing it on the basis of lectures he took in the classroom. You know, lectures he heard and the notes he took. Then he doesn't have to do the reading. He can go and do the exam. He's very clever, facile mind. And at the same time, he's running the campus newspaper. Now, it was interesting to see, and Carol and Eric will remember this, you know, when I came back, I always meet with S&B students because I accidentally became a journalist. I never meant to do it. I wasn't able to do anything else. A friend of mine told me, journalists are people who fail at something else. And I said, except in my case, I failed at everything else. So that's what he ended up doing. So I always want to know how the journalists are doing here. And I can tell you, from my time, the S&B, you know, it was okay, but now it's like another level. Now when I come in and meet with the students, we have the discussion off the record about journalistic ethics, about how you do an investigation, about how you deal with sources. I tell them something that they're actually more ethical, or let's say rarefied in the rules they apply than the New York Times is in one specific way that nobody will guess. Have you ever noticed, anybody here read the New York Times, either online or in print? Have you ever noticed how many of the quotes are so lucid and cleanly given to you? Why do you think that is? They're emails. And the Times no longer says, so-and-so said in an email message. I get quoted in the Times. And it's an email I've sent to Peter Baker or somebody, you know, when he asked me about conservatism. And it's just, you know, Mr. Tanenhaus said. I didn't say that. I spent those Joycean 8 hours composing that email. And here at the S&B, they always say an email message. And they were shocked when I told them they don't have to do that anymore. And the other thing they don't have to do, if there are any of you here, we discussed this, is you don't have to put the ums and likes and you knows in. Because you are not a stenographer, you're a reporter. So you have to convey the meaning, but you don't have to make people sound dumb because they speak the way normal people do. So these are the things we now talk about when I meet with journalists here. Buckley was a prodigy of journalism. He was born to do it. So you think about it. He doesn't read all the books. In fact, one of his best friends, a philosophy professor, I quote him in the book, Paul Weiss, who's quite well known as a philosopher, said, Bill Buckley is really good at talking about books he hasn't read. And I thought, that's kind of what I do. Is it like what most journalists do? Right? Most people don't have the time to read the book. You want to get the gist of it. You talk to somebody who can tell you what's in the book. You look at it just enough so you're not making errors. And if you have that kind of journalistic mind, you're processing this stuff all the time, and that is what you do. That's why somebody like me does what I do instead of becoming a real scholar like some of the people in the audience here. And Buckley had those abilities. And the other thing he was really good at, mentioned before, was debate. And when he got to Yale, he finally met somebody who was better at debating than he was. And we'll see how many of you recognize this name. It was L. Brent Bozell. Does anybody know that name? You know it, okay. I think his grandson was arrested on January 6th. Is that right? Was it the grandson? And Brent Bozell, who was Bill Buckley's best friend at Yale and became his brother-in-law, because he married one of Bill's sisters. Bill was always trying to get his sisters married off to Catholics. So he'd say to her, if they met somebody he really liked, have you considered converting to Catholicism? And so, well, no, why should I do that? And he said, well, we've got this sister back home. And he was pretty good at it. He'd match everybody up. Again, he didn't care if you had money, but if you really believed in the faith, the two things Buckley wanted to be was either a priest or a pianist. And he wasn't going to be a priest, and he wasn't good enough at the piano. And that's part of the reason for the humility I mentioned before that I didn't get around to explaining. So he didn't think of himself as being especially talented. And he grew up in a family where the most brilliant members were his older sisters. So that's why one of the interesting aspects of Buckley is that he was not misogynistic in a way like almost every intellectual male was in that period. Women were hired at National Review. They had important jobs at National Review. In fact, one problem, the magazine he started in 1955 when he was 29 years old, and still exists today. Well, one reason women would leave is because Buckley didn't ever think they were as good as his sisters. And the sisters were really talented. Some of them had difficult lives. Buckley's eldest sister, Aloise, she was called Allie, was the best writer in the family, and Buckley always said that. So he never thought of himself as particularly skilled at that either. He just had a very quick mind and just endless energy, the way people who accomplish a lot do. If he said he was going to do something, he would do it that day. You know, he never got put off. Then he would move on to the next thing. He didn't like writing, but he was good at it. He just went through it as quickly as he could. He would write his famous newspaper column, which was syndicated in 350 newspapers back in the day when that was the way to reach most readers. He would write some of them in 20 minutes, and sometimes they read that way. And sometimes they were really good. So there's all this great facility, and he meets a great debater, Brent Bozell. Bozell had been the best orator, schoolboy orator of his time. He won the same American Legion Prize that Frank Church from Idaho won. So he was a great speaker, golden-throated. Buckley was the maestro of the attack. Buckley would give the speech. Bozell would give the opening speech, and then Buckley would go after the other side and kind of push all the buttons and needle them, and they won debate after debate after debate. So then, junior year, after Buckley has made it onto the newspaper, and I mentioned, the S&B now feels, not in the same way the Yale paper was, but there's a bit of a competition, I think, to do things there. I've talked with newer staff there. They get paid, which they should, and they're trying to move up. You know, there's a pecking order, there's a ladder. And at the Yale Daily News, it was a daily newspaper. They called it OCD, not in the sense we mean, but the oldest college daily in America. And the models for Buckley were two partners who had been at the Daily News, Henry Luce and Britton Haddon, in the 1920s, and some people here will know who they were. They were the founders of the Time magazine empire. And Buckley came in thinking that's what he wanted to do. Only he's going to do it as an ultra-conservative. So he wins the healing competition, as they called it. Heal because the older students would treat the freshmen like dogs who had to heal. Right? They'd order them around and boss them around and make them get coffee and all this stuff. And then there was a points competition. And if you won it, then you had a good chance of becoming what they called the chairman of the newspaper, what we would call the editorial page editor, the chief editorial writer. And that's the job Buckley wanted because it meant you wrote an editorial every day. Okay? So as his first semester junior year, 1949, Buckley's won the competition. He's elected chairman of the Yale Daily News, and he wants to make a splash. And this is what we're leading to. This is what I'm telling you about is the foundation of the modern conservative movement by Buckley in 1949 as a junior at Yale. Is his predecessor had done a kind of typical okay series on the editorial page called What Makes a Course Good? 3 or 4 parts. Here are the professors, here are the things they teach you, here are the things you want to learn. It's partly to bring younger students in so they'll know which courses they might want to take and how to think about a professor in a lecture hall, maybe 2 or 3 times this size, and otherwise you're being taught by TAs. So Buckley's idea, and this is the kind of thing that just lived on the internet, was his first editorial is, what makes a course bad? And he had somebody in mind, which you're not supposed to do in campus journalism then, and you're not supposed to do it now. He had one guy in mind, a very popular professor. He was a sociologist who also was trained in and was learning the cultural anthropology of the time, who had gone for the lecture and explained to the class how all religions across different cultures are really kind of the same because they all have rituals that don't make sense to outsiders. And the professor's name is Raymond Kennedy, told a story. He said, well, when I was in the Philippines doing field research, I met some Jesuits there. And they were trying to tell me that Catholicism is different. Catholicism is a higher religion. I said, because the Eucharist is this really treasured part. They're Catholics here, no, it's really kind of the basis of your faith, is the communion, right? It's really all different ways of describing it. It's kind of Last Supper thing. It's the body and blood of Christ. And he made a joke about it. And he said, yeah, but the Eucharist, that doesn't make any more sense than like the rite of the Kubu god in some foreign land. And the Jesuits were offended by this. And they said, well, but no, we are, again, don't want people to be offended here, that no, we are, drinking the blood and eating the body of Christ. And the professor said, oh, really? Well, why don't you do a chemical analysis of the hemoglobin and show me, of the wine and show me how much hemoglobin is there. And the class finds it hilarious. And as a professor, that's what you do to open people's minds. Buckley's taking notes. What does Buckley know? He knows that this is a college whose alumni and the parent, who are the alumni and the parents are pretty much the same thing. They're conservatives from the East Coast of the United States who have big jobs on Wall Street, and they're raising their kids to be God-fearing Christians, and some guy's getting in front of a podium and making jokes about religion. And so Buckley writes a column, and he quotes all this stuff in it. And he says, look, this is hilarious. It's very funny. I laughed with everybody else. But why is this professor getting in front of a podium like this and lecturing about these things to students? He's not telling them anything about Christian theology. He's not telling them about the tradition of Augustine and Aquinas. He's not telling them the great Catholic writers like James Joyce, who hated Catholicism and nevertheless wrote about it in every page of his book. And the editorial created a sensation. And it terrified the administrators. At first, it looked like Buckley was going to lose his job, but the board decided to keep him on. Then the administrators were frightened for another reason, not because of what Buckley had done to the professor, but they're afraid their alumni are going to find out what's really going on at Yale University. Now, I know all this sounds absurd today, that parents and alumni or donors would really meddle in what goes on in a college campus. But you just have to take yourself back to those times and pretend this could really happen. So Buckley then has this theme. And letters start, we're going to end it soon. I know Ed wants me to get to questions. I want to wrap this up super quickly and then we'll do it. So the letters start coming in from students, from faculty, from professors of philosophy who tell Buckley, including Paul Weiss is one of them, I saw the letter. Well, I'm not going to say this publicly, but you're right. He's got no business speaking in that cavalier a way about a Western tradition of religion, not in front of a classroom of freshmen. You're right about that. He shouldn't do it. Buckley keeps all the letters in his scrapbook. I'm the only person who ever saw it. Then he starts getting letters from the editors of Catholic and Christian magazines throughout the country, and they wonder who this guy is. This young guy is who's making the argument that nobody else on a college campus will. Some yahoo out, no, saying this, just facetiously, out in Iowa might say that, or somebody who writes for the William Randolph Hearst's paper might say that, but somebody at Yale, the editor of the Yale Daily News, is calling out his professors, and then Buckley, a year later, graduates, and he has an idea for what he wants to do. He's got an offer to go to Time magazine, because he's a really good journalist. He has been accepted at the Yale Law School. He's been accepted in the political science department at Yale. And he doesn't want to do any of those things. If you're a journalist at Time magazine, they don't even give you a byline, and Bill Buckley wants to see his name in big lights. He does not want to master the intricacies of the law, and he does not have the kind of mind, the Ulysses reading mind, to become a scholar. So instead, he decides he'll write a book. And the book is, if you read it closely, a compilation of the essays, that essay and other ones, and speeches he gave at Yale University, as well as discussions of the textbooks that are being used. Who would read this thing? Appendixes showing what other universities are teaching in their curriculum. And Buckley showed it to his advisors and friends. Buckley had graduated by now because of his great Spanish. He's in the Spanish department teaching Spanish. And everybody he knows tells him, Bill, the book is great except for the last chapter. You'll make a fool of yourself if you publish it. But Buckley says, if I don't include the last chapter, I don't have an argument. So the last chapter says, and I mean, he's a young guy, so we'll let him say this. He says, if you don't like your professors, campaign to have them fired, create a blacklist of the ones you don't like, and if you're a wealthy donor, don't give any money to the university. Thus, the beginnings of the cultural, political revolution in America. Buckley was 25 when that book was published, and it got onto the New York Times bestseller list. And then it was all upward. And I mention it to students, not because I think you should agree with Buckley, because I think most of us would, but to see the confidence and courage he had just to go out there and do it. Yeah, he's a rich guy. His father spent thousands of dollars to promote the book. He had people who helped him one way or another, but he was not afraid to make the case he wanted to make. And sometimes I think that's what's kind of like subsiding a little bit now. We live in a very tough time, and people just don't think they have that courage to do it. They're invited to do it, the occasion or opportunity to do it. So do we have some time for, I know I ran along here, Ed, sorry about that. Do you want to get some questions in?
We do have
Yeah, let's just get them going. And I'll repeat it so it gets, so people can hear it. So if you have a question to ask, just go for it.
Announcements first. One is that Sam Ennison and Jeffrey Olson were the two lucky winners of the book giveaway. So Kylie has that aside. The second is that we have some time for questions. If you're a student and you want to continue the conversation, we'll have a lunch with Mr. Tanenhaus after this. And I'd say, please come. You can see he's a very engaging and approachable speaker. So just come and see me if you're interested. But now we have time for questions.
Yeah, should we want to get anybody? You want to talk about anything? No, I've stunned everybody into silence here. Not even one Donald Trump question. I'm amazed by it. Yeah, there's somebody back. There's a question.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad summer's coming up. So we can read your book. You said this very interesting phrase about how President Buckley's family saw the Roosevelts as the kind of opponents. And of course, I think, and you said Bolshevism. taking everything down and so forth. And of course I think of Harry Hopkins, Grinnell graduate, who was the architect of the New Deal, which was part of really having the government come through for the people in so many different ways. And so my question is simple. Was Harry Hopkins and the way that Harry Hopkins used government and spent, at the time, billions of dollars, was Harry Hopkins and his way of government interacting with people on William Buckley's mind at all? Was that part of what he was also?
Yeah, well, that's what they were super aware of. You know what Buckley wanted to do politically, and this is why I say you can see parallels between not necessarily Donald Trump, but the MAGA movement and the Buckley movement. It really is about kind of dismantling that big government apparatus. And if you came from a certain background at a certain time with certain privileges, it seemed to you that the glory of America was really in that earlier era, like the late 19th century through the Gilded Age, when rich people kind of made the country run, the great industrialists. And they would do the hiring, they would give people work. And yes, we know all the other things that went on, right? Why we needed labor unions and the rest. But yes, that's the politics that Buckley was opposed to. And I don't know if he ever came to Grinnell. He went to he did come. When did he come?
In the 90s, he gave a convocation, and a lot of people were bussed in from Chicago to hear him. It was free.
Wow. I'm guessing not many people were bussed in from Chicago to hear me. Yeah. Well, were you there? Did you hear him? Yeah.
No, because that was the thing, is they filled the chapel. And there wasn't
The chapel, right? Yeah, because that's where they did them. And so interesting. And he was a very engaging, warm person. I've been telling people here, to get to know him, it was really surprising. He was very different in person from what you saw in public. And he told me, so the only time I talk about politics is when I'm paid to do it. And he was paid a lot to do it. Otherwise, it was music, it was sailing, it was his novels, and he did become more of a reader. What he read in the New Yorker, what he read in the New York Times, that's what he liked to talk about. And that way he was a very broad-minded, liberal-minded person. It's kind of interesting. Yeah, anything else?
Thank you. It's a treat hearing you in person. I've heard you on the Know Your Enemy podcast several times.
Know Your Enemy podcast, right? Those guys are fun. Yeah.
Great. I'm just curious what kind of through line you might draw from Buckley and his understanding of Catholicism and the right to what we're seeing today in the sort of co-opting of much of the Catholic intellectual world and politicians like J.D. Vance and others, and their sort of distortion, in my opinion, of Catholicism. What kind of through line or influence do you see there?
That's a really sophisticated, important question about Buckley's Catholicism versus the Catholicism of a new generation, like J.D. Vance would be an example of it. Here's one key difference. Buckley was, some will know the term, a cradle Catholic. J.D. Vance is a Catholic convert. Brent Bozell was a Catholic convert. And I don't want to overgeneralize, but Catholic converts tend to be more rigid in as far as doctrine and liturgy. They're more fanatical about it. Buckley was fanatical about politics, but not really about religion. For instance, Buckley, until his last years, didn't care very much about abortion one way or the other. And I said this the other night, and I do not want to offend anybody, just to give you the flavor of it. Buckley thought abortion was fine for anybody who wasn't Catholic, because then you could keep the other populations down. Well, they're right, the Catholics can multiply. Also, Buckley, in that era, the late 60s, some will remember this, there was all this concern about the population, right, bomb, right? And Buckley was aware of that. And in those ways, he was more liberal-minded. But the other thing about being a cradle Catholic is, in that era, you grew up in a community of Catholics. And one of my idols and a great friend of mine now, Gary Wills, a brilliant Catholic writer, one of Buckley's first finds as a writer, grew up as a cradle Catholic. So when he went to church, that means you don't know what people's beliefs are. They're just there because they're raised Catholic. So it's like the Thanksgiving dinner, where people have all in your family with all different points of view. So it's a less rigid doctrinaire Catholicism. It's the people who come to it later and kind of adopt it as armor that they plate themselves in. They're the ones who become very unforgiving. Here's an example I give. Bill Buckley would never have said Joe Biden was a bad Catholic, because for him there was no such thing as a bad Catholic. You're either a Catholic or you're not. He might disagree with you down the line. Another piece I couldn't put in the book, I published in Commonweal magazine, was about a fight Buckley had with the Vatican over an encyclical, where he was to the right of the Vatican and he quarreled with them a little bit. But he would never say the Pope is not the final authority. And if the Pope is liberal, well, that's your Pope now, you see? So that's really different. Another Catholic convert who's very smart, and I know somewhat, is Ross Douthat at the New York Times. He's a convert. So when he writes about the church, it's good Catholics and bad Catholics and good popes and bad popes. And the cradle Catholics don't do that so much. So that's a real difference, I think. We can do one more. Somebody back, oh, two people back there. They could do it in harmony. Oh.
To continue the conversation about the influence of his Catholic upbringing and the parallels you made with the Kennedys, I was wondering what you think that impact had in his time at Yale, when there was still, to my understanding, like an unofficial quota of Catholics that were accepted to Yale. Do you think that his class status had an impact on how he felt his belonging and authority to speak to the alumni and the donors about how they should be influencing?
That's a fantastic question, because it goes to something that Buckley didn't realize until he was almost finished with his college career, which that there was a quota against Catholics at Yale University. And if you and Jews. It was 13% Jews, 13% Catholics, and of course there are no people of color anywhere in America, so we don't have to worry about them. So Buckley, if you look at the book closely, there's not a hint of Catholic theology in it. For one reason, Buckley didn't know very much about Catholic theology. He'd gone to secular schools. He'd only had 1 year of Catholic training. And his answer to that was, Yale is a Christian school. And that's how Buckley would always define his magazine, National Reviews, as a Christian school. And when he learned about the quota on Catholics, he was a little shocked by it. But he stuck enough to his ideology that he didn't let that come into the argument he made. But I think it gave him pause. You know, the thing I almost put in the book and decided not to is Catholics, you know, again, I just don't want to offend anybody, but Catholics can move in and out of culture the way gay and trans people often can. That is, nobody ever says, like they would to me, someone would say, well, you know, you look Jewish, right? Nobody would ever say, that's funny, you don't look Catholic, right? And so you're not aware of it in the same way, and you can live socially in a very exalted way without people knowing that that's what your religion is. Now, Buckley was proud of it. He went to Mass. But I think he began to see, if you look at that first editorial he wrote, he's writing that as a Catholic against a kind of liberal Protestant. And if anybody cares about this stuff, there was a famous Yale English professor, you'll know who he is, Clarence Brooks, who was a famous literary scholar, one of the New Critics, back when New Critics meant something different, who was very much a conservative Protestant, was a friend of all the Buckleys, and he wrote essays in the 1930s accusing liberal Protestants of not being truly religious, giving way to the New Deal, arguments very much like the ones Buckley made. So there was always a segment of the culture that was aligned with Buckley. That's what you see also with Trump. You know, if you get to that outer ring of intellectuals, we haven't talked about the post-liberal Catholics. They're mainly converts too. Adrian Vermeule's a convert. Patrick Deneen, I think, is a cradle Catholic. Sohrab Ahmari is a convert, and they're the ones. J.D. Vance is the most famous example. They're adopting it later, and it's becoming an ideology for them. When Buckley got an honorary degree at Notre Dame, Father Hesburgh was quite liberal in the 1970s, and Buckley's wife, Pat, whom I didn't even mention, most famous socialite in New York, made a joke about him. She's very conservative too. And Bill Buckley said, he's a priest. We don't speak that way about him. It didn't matter what his politics were. So in a way, it almost became more, inclusive and encompassing in its way. Buckley, I also learned, donated a great deal of money to Catholic charter schools in Harlem. For Buckley, that's the perfect thing. You have black kids in the inner city go to a Catholic school where they'll be well educated. Like, that works for him. And in retrospect, there is more generosity to it than you might think. I found check after check in the archives that Buckley wrote to HBCUs, to the NAACP, even while he carrying on all this stuff publicly. He thought you could do the private and public thing in a different way. We can't do that now. Can't do that now. No one accepts it. No one will accept that you can be sincerely generous as a person if you have objectionable ideological views. We just won't accept that anymore, and I think it's kind of a shame. Yeah, now there were these two guys back here. We're going to get them in. Can't we just lock the door so the next people can't get in here? And these people have to stay?
I think this is a good question to lock the door for. Because, we were just wondering, with all the stuff that's happened in the last few years and in relation to the the conservative movement that Buckley really pioneered, kind of how the similarities between Charlie Kirk, not saying anything in support of, but I think, it's just worth having a conversation of, and also like a convert, like you said, but how do you think William Buckley and that time of political violence and partly saying objectionable things and maybe having a different private versus public life and et cetera compares to now?
I have been waiting for many months now for somebody to ask me about Charlie Kirk and Buckley. And I'll tell you, when I first was doing presentations on the book, it came out in June, and I did some pretty large events, like one at the Smithsonian or Library of Congress with 600 or 700 people there and young people in the audience. And Charlie Kirk's name never came up. And then, right, one date, all of this changed, and the reaction to my book changed, because people started seeing that Charlie Kirk was in some ways similar to Buckley. Here's what some of the differences are. Like, it's true, the reason the two are compared often, just as you say, is Bill Buckley loved meeting with students. He would go on campuses. He went, I think, by the time he was 30, he had been to 44 of the 50 states speaking to college audiences. And he would meet privately with students or invite them to groups. He started an organization called ISI, if any of you are familiar with it. It was then called, he was really the front person for it. Another guy started it, but Buckley was their star. It was called the Individualist Society, and now it's called the Institute for Studies or something. Individualist meant libertarian. And Buckley would meet with students, but he debated professors. Charlie Kirk would have you come up as an 18 or 19-year-old, and should we think how young Charlie Kirk was? Buckley was famous when he was 5 to 7 years younger than Charlie Kirk. And he would say, who's the smartest liberal professor on your campus at Harvard, at Williams College, here at Grinnell? And I'll meet them on stage publicly and let the public decide. That's a different kind of debate, you see. So it's not, and what Buckley would do, it's very interesting. He was famous as a speaker, but he was not as good extemporaneously as people thought. So he would he'd prepare his opening remarks. They would be very carefully written. He was quite a skilled writer. And that would be his presentation. And then when we got to this part, the Q&A, then the wit would kick in. But Buckley was always aware that he wanted to persuade the people on the other side. It went all the way back to Milberg. So that's the difference between the two of them. What was similar is this like this passion for converting people, which I think I never met Charlie Kirk, and I heard about him years ago from a neighbor in Connecticut who was a follower of his at the University of Connecticut. And he said, you ought to write about him. And when I looked him up, he just didn't seem that interesting to me. Like when Buckley was coming up, the most brilliant people in America wanted to meet him and write about him. The first great profile of Buckley, in some ways the very best, was written by the most respected cultural critic of the time, Dwight MacDonald. Wrote about Buckley when he was 25 years old. He called it God and Buckley at Yale was the profile, right? And Charlie Kirk comes out of this era. So it's quick, it's YouTube, and he's right to have done all of that. And I really get why Ezra Klein and others, we were talking about this last night, why they want to say, yeah, this guy is doing it the right way, because they're comparing him to the other stuff that's going on. So when I started hearing a second wave, my book, so I'm going to make a confession here. It's not really a confession because it's not a secret. I have done 5 hours on the War Room podcast with Steve Bannon. And that happened after September. What was September 9th? September 10th, when Charlie Kirk was killed. Because Buckley, who before then was really being attacked on the racial history that I gave you some aspect of, suddenly Buckley looked very different. Not because Charlie Kirk was killed, but because what came in the aftermath of it. When the big names, Nick Fuentes and Tucker Carlson and all these people seem to be moving things in a much more confrontational and militant. And I think he used the word, did you use the word violence? Yeah, there's a kind of implicit, listen, there's violence in speech as well as violence in action, right? We're all kind of learning that. It's something we should always know, but nevertheless. And Buckley, he would go pretty far sometimes. But he would always try to pull back. And when he thought he'd made a mistake, then, being a good Catholic, he would go and confess, sometimes confess in print. But I think, there are parallels and some differences. The other thing is, Buckley thought he needed to be read by liberal intellectuals and writers. That's why he started the first really excellent conservative magazine. And the people he hired, who were his elders, most of them 20 years older than he was, were the best conservative thinkers in America. I'll give you an example of one. How many of you know the name James Burnham? Does that mean anything? You do. You know everything. What are you doing here? James Burnham had been the leading Trotskyist intellectual in America. And he wrote a book some of you may have heard of called The Managerial Revolution. And The Managerial Revolution is the basis of George Orwell's 1984. Burnham described a world divided into three parts, and he saw that there was a new managerial class, and all that's the basis of 1984. Plus, there's an entire underground book in 1984. That's the one they pass around secretly. That's Burnham's parody of the Managerial Revolution. So that's how big a guy Burnham was. That's who Buckley wanted around him. And I don't see that same thing now. And don't get me wrong, there are brilliant writers and thinkers on the right. But this is something I learned in the work I do, is the intellectuals like to think they're leading the parade, but they don't. They're the bandwagoners. They're the ones who jump on because you need your charismatic populist figure and you follow him. So I didn't even really mention Buckley's second political hero. Anybody know who it was? You probably do. I don't think you're allowed to say. It was Joe McCarthy. Right? A lot of people know this. And Buckley and his brother-in-law Bozell wrote a book about McCarthy. It's still the one plausible defense of McCarthy. I'm not saying it works, but it's the most plausible. They go through the evidence and they have footnotes, and it's very tricky. But and they keep ceding ground to the enemy. They know he's wrong here, they know he's wrong there, but they want to make a kind of case for him. And that was a book that their mentors helped them write because they thought they needed to make that case. And that may be a difference in that political culture and journalistic culture and our own. Because now you go on YouTube, man, you write, you get it out on the phone. You've got graduates of Harvard, unlike graduates of Grinnell, who can't read a 14-line sonnet. So why are you going to bother? Was it Sam Bankman-Fried? Wasn't he the guy who said, why would anybody read a book when you can just read 2 sentences? Eric, wasn't he the one who said that? I think he did, right? Brilliant guy, parents are major academics, and he thinks he's smart when he says that, So I don't even blame the ideologues and conservatives on the right. That's something we've all done, I think, collectively. When I ask my hero, Gary Wills, and other people's, who's 90 now, and they say, he's actually 92, and they say, how did we get here? And he says, yeah, it's we who got us here. Nobody did this to us. We did it to ourselves, which means we can undo it too. Do we want to try to get one more in? Or we don't want to? Okay. All right, well, thank you, everybody. Yeah, things to do. Yeah.